Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. We're gonna have a look at updated estimations for NIO going forwards. Obviously looking at the potential rumors and discussion about profitability by end of the year. My numbers is gonna be based on my expected delivery numbers. We know that NIO's delivery in June was 25,000 almost, and I would expect that July will have somewhat of an increase to 29,000. Previously, I've expected above 30,000, obviously ever since March, if I'm honest, from like end of last year, but that's not gonna be the case. So we have to reevaluate our case for when NIO will be profitable, and let's look at the numbers. But before we go there, so let's look what have changed since we last did one of these videos of when NIO potentially will be profitable. So we can see that the lithium carbonate price is still very low. It already went down below 60,000 actually just a couple of weeks ago. Now it's just about 63,000. So let's say that the lithium carbonate price for the battery manufacturers and obviously trickling down to the OEMs like NIO, XPeng, Tesla and so on. This is going to be helpful going forwards. You can also quickly look at the stock price around 3.9 US dollars, so quite shambolic if we are honest for the long-term investors, but also offering potentially a insane good value if things go in the right direction. But again, let's not take that for granted that these things are going in the right direction. If there's anything we know with NIO is that the management is probably one of the worst management in the history of the stock market, in my opinion. So let's not take everything for granted. Going at have a look at competitor, you can see that Tesla, for example, they managed to have a kind of stagnation over the past year. I mean, month to month, there's quite large changes. In fact, if you look at the week to week delivery numbers for Tesla, look at this graph here, you can see weekly insurance numbers. I've tracked NIO and XPeng in white compared to Tesla in red. You can see that there was a huge peak in week 26, which is 2 weeks ago. Tesla delivered 20,680 cars from China, and NIO and XPeng peaked at 17,500. Really nice numbers, but usually we see huge peaks for Tesla by the last week of the quarter. So I think that's essentially what we saw, and you can see that this sharp drop from 20,000 to 5,000 for Tesla. So the competitors, I would say, at least if you only look at Tesla, is stagnating a little bit over the longer term. Look at, for example, when you add the separate NIO, XPeng, Tesla and Li Auto, you can see Li Auto was really strong. In fact, if you go back to, if you go back to last year, Li Auto was already at these kind of levels, like 7, 6, 8, 9, 10,000 deliveries a week. XPeng was like closer to 4 to 6,000 and NIO between 3 to 4, 5,000. This year, I would say XPeng has got closer to Li Auto, and NIO is still struggling a little bit, although they are kind of at least getting. It's very rarely that we see NIO deliver less than 4,000 a week, right? So especially now that obviously the Onvo and the Firefly is finally averaging at least 1,000 cars each, the traditional NIO brand would also do at least a couple of thousand across all these different models. Remember, NIO has so many different models, right? And if you consider that the sales for each of the models is not that high. In fact, if you go to look at the CNEB report of NIO June delivery numbers, you can see that bar, like I would say a couple of models, right? The NIO ES6, a really nice volume car for NIO, delivering anywhere between 3 to 6,000 a month, and this is this single car here, the ES6. Then you have a NIO EC6. It's a little bit difficult to see the difference, but this is essentially the coupe version of that car with the tilted roof at the end. And that one is also, doing some heavy lifting for NIO. So ES6, EC6 is doing very good. Then we have the ET5 and ET5 Touring doing quite good. The ES8 is doing somewhat of a good delivery numbers. And then ET9, obviously this is a highly luxury car. You shouldn't expect high volume delivery numbers for that one. But still, I would say a little bit disappointing as usual. There's a lot of talk about ET9 on Twitter that people expected it to deliver almost 1,000 cars every single month, and you can see that over the past 4 months they've delivered 1,800, 1,900 cars. So more likely like 400 to 500 deliveries a month is more realistic at this current stage for ET9, and we are not even less than 3 or 4 months into the life cycle of that car. So a little bit of a disappointing, but this is traditional how NIO does. I mean, look at ET9 since the start of delivery in March of 2022. Sorry, ET7. Huge peak, and this is the time where, you know, Li Bin went out and said, oh, we're gonna deliver 30,000 cars or like 20,000 ET7s in a year's time every single month. And look at where they are now. They're delivering 271 units as of June of this year. Look at the EC7, even worse, 84 deliveries in June. Look at the ES7, 0 deliveries in June. And it's been this case for ES7 for the longest of times. And this is what I'm talking about. Why invest so much money in the R&D spend and the R&D budget? Why do you make these huge losses as if you're NIO? Like, why is the stock price down? The stock price is down because this company has making huge losses over the longest of terms. Like they've lost like almost $1 billion in Q4 of last year, almost $1 billion in Q1 of this year. They lost a huge like 835 million in Q2 of 23, and they've averaged like well above 500-600 million net loss every single quarter for the past 3 years, right? And sometimes closing to 1 billion. This is the reason why the stock price has been going down, and why the once huge cash position of 7 to 8 billion, you know, in 2022, 2023, when they raised quite a lot of money, was like people would see that cash position as, you know, cushion for survivability for NIO. Like, and most expectations was at this kind of time, like 2 or 3 years later, this company would be very safe. But because they continue to invest in like unnecessary stuff, one of those unnecessary stuff is obviously the NIO swap infrastructure. They're still averaging like less than 30 swaps across their entire fleet of swap stations per day. So let that settle in. Like, they're averaging less than 30 swaps per single swap station every single day. But the capacity of each of those swap stations, especially on the Gen 4s, is 480 swaps a day. So they're not even utilizing less than 7% of what the actual swap station can handle on each day. And for some unexplained reason, they're still continuing to build out these swap stations where there is absolutely no necessity to build out. Like, you could argue there is somewhat of a need to build ahead of the, you know, the consumers and the people that buy the cars, sure, but not to this extent. Like, I mean, if they would be at 20-30%, maybe, just maybe, you could explain that. But not at this case where they're like doing 25 to 30 swaps a day on average, and they can handle like 400-500 per, especially on the newer ones. So this is one of those, you know, wasted money. We have also had, you know, obviously the very famous NIO phone. Remember that NIO started to sell NIO phone like in 2023. They sold 50,000 units, and long story short, it's just like not good enough. I mean, LG, one of the biggest phone manufacturers on the planet over the past 2 decades, they threw in the towel in 2021 after delivering 24 million phones. Let just sink in. So LG, one of the best companies on the planet, sell 24 million phones in 2020 or 2021. They feel that, damn, we don't have the, you know, the scalability to compete with Samsung and Apple and the Chinese manufacturers. And then NIO, a company in a dire situation, decides with the CEO, oh, let's do phones, and they sell 50,000 phones. Like, come on, this is an utter joke. Like, let's be honest, even you bulls out there, you have to admit it. This is nonsense. But in any case, the point of the video was to give you the expectations on when possibly NIO will be profitable. And this is when we look at the numbers. And I would start with looking at the last earnings. I would say that based on the earnings that we had in Q1 at 42,000 deliveries, they made a net loss of 930 million. But since then, the management has really, you know, talked about cutting and reducing the operating expenses, for example, research and development costs, right? So they actually from Q4 of last year to Q1 of this year, they reduced their R&D budget by 60 million, which is 12% decrease in quarter over quarter. And that is really nice. That is truly in the right direction, right? And we know that they delivered 72,000 cars in Q2 of this year. And I would expect that based on that, and looking at the average sales price of, let's say, roughly similar to the average sales price of Q1. Why do I say that? Well, we know that the Onvo and Firefly are going to reduce the average sales price, but we know also that the ET9 is going to increase the average sales price. So I'm assuming somewhat they equal each other out. But going forwards, I would expect that it will be like significantly affected. Because why? So in Q3, I'm expecting NIO to deliver 100,000 cars. How do I arrive at 100,000 car deliveries? Well, I'm expecting NIO to deliver roughly, let's say, 29,000 cars in July, 32 in August, and 37,000 cars in September, which is obviously Q3, right? You add all those up and that comes just below 100,000, 98,000 deliveries. So in fact, let's go there to now the earnings sheet, and we can see that if we put in here, update the number here, 98,000 deliveries instead of 100,000. But in any case, that would still be like huge increase compared to the best historical quarter, which is obviously Q4 of last year at 73,000, and Q2 of this year came very close. But at 98,000 deliveries, which average sales price of 30,000, again, the reason we will lose ASP quite sharply, now you might argue not that sharply, I might revise that number to 31,000 or maybe even 31,500. But those additional almost 25-30,000 cars from Q2 to Q3 is going to be mostly Onvo and Firefly to some degree, which with much lower ASPs than the traditional the traditional NIO. So this is why the ASP is going to go down, and I arrive at a total revenue of around 3.3 billion US dollar, again all-time high for NIO. That would also mean our vehicle sales are around just below 3 billion, 2.9 billion US dollar. Other sales all-time high of 370 million or so. And I expect other sales to continue to slowly go up every single quarter because the fleet size is increasing, and that's good actually for other sales, I would say. So looking at the cost of vehicles and cost of other sales, we arrive at a gross profit of let's say above 500 million for the first time, as long as I remember. In fact, let's look at the historical numbers, and we can see that NIO has never been over $500 million in gross profit, right? So that's a really good number actually. $500 million in gross profit. I'm really happy. Then this is the big the question here: operating expenses. How much will they continue to reduce the R&D expenses and the SG&A, the sales essentially? The sales budget, I would say, is more difficult to cut. We've seen some improvement. There was an article, maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago, where they mentioned that Onvo sales went up 40% despite the sales kind of cost went down 40%. That was a really good article, if that's anywhere near close to the reality. Obviously, you shouldn't expect those kind of improvement every single quarter. It's like once or twice, maybe every other year. But I would say that's moving in the right direction, and that's probably the reason why I'm gonna stagnate the SG&A expense at around 550 to 600 million. Let's go with 600 million because they're still gonna increase their sales to almost 100,000 on Q3. That's the expectations. I'm much more, let's say it's much more doable to expect that the R&D expense is gonna go down from 440 million to, let's say, less than 400, potentially 375. And this is where I say it's up to the management. They can, at any time, at any moment, decide to cut down on 3 or 4 of these models here. Again, do not forget that the ES7 sold a fat 0 in June, right? The EC7 sold an entire 84 units in June. The ET7 sold 271. You could argue at least EC7 and ES7 is for sure like just stop sell those cars. It just doesn't make sense, right? And then you also, if you reduce the number of cars, you obviously reduce the R&D expenses. You just make it more lean. You can focus your sales business on fewer models, and you also have less, let's say, competition between your models. I mean, even as a person that has been followed NIO closely for 4 or 5 years, still to this day, it's so difficult to understand what is what here. Like, you look at these models and you just don't see the difference. Imagine if you're a consumer, you're trying to buy a potential consumer, or customer, you're trying to buy one of these cars. Where would you even start? Like, what's the difference between these, right? I mean, it's just like bonkers. The cannibalization on NIO is like a self-inflicted damage from the management. From, let's say, the lack of management from the so-called CEO, William Li. Like, I'm not sure what he's even doing, like, and the rest of them. So reduce the number of cars, reduce the R&D expensive, utilize the lithium carbonate price, still you continuing to go down. and we could easily potentially go to 350 million in R&D expenses. And with the gross profit of above $500 million, the net loss would go less than $500 million already by let's say, by Q3 of this year. And if they manage to continue on this trend, remember that the Onvo is actually have quite nice momentum. Let's not forget that the Onvo deliveries is starting to, L60, only one single model. Look at the advantage of having only one single model, right? Onvo is selling 6,000 cars. Sure, it's a much cheaper car than the average of what the NIO premium brand is. So it's not apples to apples, but still, one single car delivered 6,000 in last month. With L90, maybe more expensive car, even if we conservatively settle for around 3,000 and L60 continues this trend and maybe averages 7,000, L60 and L90 combined will do 10,000 deliveries every single month. That's what we want to see from NIO. So I think if they continue at this kind of rate, I can see NIO deliver 110,000 deliveries, maybe 115,000 deliveries by Q4. And doing the same math, I would say that NIO will lose less than 300 million in Q3 in Q4 and less than around 400 million in Q3. And by end of this year, although we might not be profitable, there is a clear path for NIO to become almost profitable. And I would say if they do that, people and the stock price would react. I would say that if you hold a gun to my head and if NIO delivers less than 300 million in net loss in Q4, I would have a hard time to believe that NIO stock wouldn't be let's say above at least $7 or $8 honestly. It just doesn't make sense, because by that time you could also see how extrapolating to Q1, Q2 of next year with Onvo getting market recognition, the Firefly start to deliver high numbers, maybe reduce the number of NIO cars and have more focused sales on 5 to 7 models instead of 9 to 12 models on the traditional NIO brand. They could easily do 130,000 deliveries by Q2 of next year, and they would by then become profitable. So essentially 1 year from now, NIO could be profitable, and all that is required is for this management for once stop with this nonsensical expansion of NIO swap infrastructure, this nonsensical spend on NIO phone, and just do what's the minimum requirement for a somewhat okay management team. Honestly, how could it be that every critic is wrong and the management that has ended up with a stock price in shambles for past 4 or 5 years is right? Obviously, they're doing something wrong. The market is telling them they're doing something wrong. So it's just time. And I think this is, for a lot of you that might think that I'm quite negative on NIO, look at my conclusion. By end of the day, everything is in the hand of the management. They have the delivery numbers. In fact, if you compare to a little bit longer perspective, you look at, for example, deliveries per year, and you look at NIO, this is the green numbers. They went from 43,000 in 2020 and expected to do almost 350,000 in 2025. They're gonna do 5 to 6 times increase of sales in just 4.5 years. That is an insane delivery increase for a car company, automotive company. At this kind of rate, a couple of years from now, they could be easily above 500,000 annual sales. So they have everything at hand to become one of the best EV sale company in the planet. All that is required is for the management for once to do their job. So anyways, thanks for your time. Please like, subscribe, and do you agree with me that everything that is stopping the company to become successful and the stock price finally, kind of finding its way out from this black hole that is currently in, only for the management to get their act together. See you in the next one.